League of Women Voters of Palo Alto is thrilled to launch our new program year in studio with Congresswoman Eshoo. The format for today is a 1-hour conversation with questions submitted by members and participants in today's program. But the overarching theme is making our democracy work. Before we jump in, I want to thank Congresswoman Eshoo for her service to our district for over 25 years. I just learned that her office has responded to constituents 78,329 times through letters and emails back from questions we've asked. And she is just known as a boundary crosser and consistently receives high reviews in our district for her work. But I also just want to thank you for your longevity to really ethical and effective public service, which is what the League is about as well. So as you know, the League of Women Voters was started nearly a century ago after women got the right to vote. We cherish our work to empower citizens through education and civic engagement, and we're truly about making democracy work. And while many in the country are organizing and staying informed, politics still remains a spectator sport for many of us. What's top of mind for ways that we can work to fully engage and inspire our citizens to protect our fragile democracy?
Well, thank you, Megan and Aisha, for moderating. To the League of Women Voters, thank you. Thank you for what you do, the civic engagement, education, and strengthening the democratic process. And I think that today's gathering is really timely because our democracy needs to be strengthened. We all know that. The most often asked question of me is, what can I do? Since November. Since November. There are consequences to elections. And I spent a lot of time tossing and turning on that one. And earlier this year, I put together a forum, and we had 37 organizations that we invited. They tabled. It was in Palo Alto at a hotel. And there was real electricity that went through that meeting. Now, what I wanted to accomplish was A, to bring together all the organizations. B, so that organizations know who else is out there. We make the assumption that everyone knows everyone, but they really don't. And each organization has its own mission, but there's an overlap. And I think that what came out of that, and I'm going to do another one hopefully before the end of this year, is to have organizations partner with one another, because the more you have, the more effective you can be, because there's a commonality to it. There is our community is really rich in organizations. Many organizations were born right after the election. So what really gives me a great deal of hope, always my constituents, number one, but number two, that there is a real effort across the country of civic engagement.
So
and this is, it's more than I've ever seen since I was first elected to the Board of Supervisors in 1982. So it's a very healthy thing that's going on in the country.
So one question, a lot of those groups are trying to get people to contact members of Congress on various topics. Do majority and minority leaders and people, I know you respond to us because I opened with that, but do other people care when people from Silicon Valley are calling on them?
The most effective contact for a member of Congress, any member of Congress, is from their own constituents. First of all, we don't have the capability to respond to people from Utah and Alabama and all of that. So let me give you a very good example, concrete example, and it was the American people, extraordinary, ordinary people, that threw overboard the immoral healthcare legislation that was proposed. And how was that done? It was done by, again, extraordinary, ordinary people contacting their member of Congress. They went to their offices. They sat in. They went to town hall meetings. They even wore badges with their zip code to prove to the member of Congress that they were that member's constituent.
Yeah.
So that is the most eloquent statement.
Yeah.
When a member's constituents show up.
Okay.
Great.
Because they're the ones that they want the vote from.
Right.
No, it's so important to have the engagement of our civic groups, and many are here this afternoon, and it's wonderful to have you here. Thank you so much.
I'm delighted to be here. I'm excited.
I'm going to jump in right into the questions because I know that everybody wants to hear from you about a lot of issues that are top of mind for many of us here. And I'd like to start with the topic of immigration and DACA, which has been in the news and is near and dear to many of us who live in California. The League believes in ensuring that no group or persons should suffer legal, economic, or administrative discrimination. In light of the actions of the Attorney General and the President this week, we would like to start by addressing the topic of DACA and immigration. Through your support of the DREAM Act and DACA, which aim to protect undocumented students and childhood arrivals, you have been an advocate for sound immigration. California has 561,000 DACA eligible immigrant youth, making up 29% of the US total.
Yes.
That's quite a number.
The largest in the country.
Largest in the country. Here's the question. What plans do you have in place to work with Dreamers and their families in light of the recent news of ending DACA? Also, what is your strategy for working with Congress to pass immigration legislation to overrule the President's action?
Well, I wish I were the speaker because there's enormous power there. These are children that were brought into the country as youngsters. So through no fault of their own, are they in the category of not being citizens and holding the status that they do. President Obama issued an executive order to protect this group, almost 800,000 in our country, who on every level have succeeded, participating in the military, graduating from high school, going on to college, working, paying taxes. They add something like $433 billion to our national economy. So they are value added to our country. Not will be, they already are. Now, only Congress can write a statute. And so that's why the new administration could chuck what President Obama did. So where are we? As of it was such a sad day when the president made the announcement last Tuesday. And we had press conferences on the Hill. There were so many of these young people with us, but they were all crying. They were all crying because they are terrified. Now, the Democratic leader had a conversation with the president Wednesday morning, and Thursday morning, he called her on another issue, and she told the president that he needed to do something and do it immediately. And her request of him was that in the next 6 months, that it would not be roundup time, that nothing would take place. To give the Congress some breathing room, because we need to place this in statute, and to give comfort to these some 800,000 young people in our country who are terrified, as are their families. This tears families apart.
Well,
the only country they know is the United States of America. They love it. They pledge allegiance to our flag. And the only thing they don't have is paper. And we need to provide that. Now, the president agreed to it. He sent out a tweet. Now, that's... he does change his mind like the weather, but he did put it out and notified the Secretary of Homeland Security that there would be no sweeps, and so that gives me
Well, that's been the main
comfort.
concern for a lot of
gives
people.
That gives me comfort. but the Congress needs to place this in statute. Now, two things. Number one, the Speaker has to agree to allow the legislation to come to the floor so we can vote on it. If he agreed to do that this coming week, it would pass. We have the votes for it. Almost to every member
And this is the DREAM Act of
yes,
2017.
the DREAM Act. So I'm hopeful that he will allow that legislation to come to the floor, and we do have the votes. We need maybe 28 Republicans, and that would do it. I think that that legislation will pass before the end of the year.
Great. We want to move on continuously. Another big issue, healthcare and the Affordable Care Act. As you mentioned earlier also, how important it is to get this right. The League believes that the responsible government shares in solutions that provides improvements to general welfare of citizens, and we applaud your efforts to protect the Affordable Care Act and all the work that you've been doing from a regulatory and legislative standpoint, and attacks on the repeal, so thank you.
Yes.
The Senate convened a bipartisan healthcare committee that is working on ways to stabilize and shore up insurance markets under the Affordable Care Act, and is set to meet this month, from what I understand. How can the House of Reps aid in the Senate's efforts to strengthen the ACA and protect consumers who are facing sharp premium increases and the shrinking number of insurance options that they have in the states?
Well, I think that in the aftermath of the total collapse of the effort of the majority in Congress, and thank God that bill went down, but we do know that the Affordable Care Act does need needs reforms. It's very, very large legislation. No legislation is ever perfect. It's designed by human beings. I'm encouraged because there is bipartisan interest. Now, that doesn't mean that everything is set to go, but there is bipartisan interest. Senate hearings with Lamar Alexander being the chair of his committee in the Senate. A group of governors put out a white paper, and they will be testifying. They have a list of, I think, some 10 recommendations. Myself on the Democratic side and some members of my committee that has jurisdiction over this issue in the House have been meeting, and many of our recommendations mirror what the bipartisan group of governors are recommending. So it's not that we don't know what to do and how to do it, it's a matter of doing it. So hopefully between the Senate and the House, we can forge legislation that will shore up the Affordable Care Act, make it stronger, attract insurers so that there really are choices in places in the country where there aren't. The good news is that California is a model because it's working very well here. Now, we're never satisfied. We want more. We want everyone enrolled. But California is a model for it. You see, there are many states where the governors decided that they would not participate. That is an act of punishment to the people of their entire state. So when they say there aren't any markets, there isn't this, there isn't that, well, I mean, they came out of the box saying, we're just not going to participate. So anyway, that's where we are right now. But the American people really deserve to have this addressed because there isn't anything more profoundly personal than healthcare.
Absolutely.
And for women we have very complicated bodies. The health care that is required for women really needs to be addressed in the insurance product.
I also wanted to address the proposal in California to adopt a single payer Medicare for all, and what are your views on that, and how I think their buy-in age is going to be going up to 55, so people can actually buy in starting at 55. and what are your views on that?
Well, I love how these ideas come back a decade or two later, because it was in the beginning of my service in the Congress that we considered a buy-in for people that were not yet eligible for Medicare. So I welcome that coming back. Now, the Medicare for All in California, that bill, it's very good legislation because it covers everyone for everything. All right, that's the really terrific part of it. No one has really figured out how to pay for it. The legislative analyst, I think, came up with a $400 or $450 billion a year paid for in that. And in my reading of it, the advocates say that Medicare and Medicaid will pay for it. Well, the Medicare trust fund right now is strained. We just went through an enormous battle to save Medicaid, because it's an entitlement that my Republican friends have no love for or respect for. Let me just put it that way. I know, I see it every day in my committee. So these are huge price tags. The important, I think, principle here is that we keep building the system so that everyone actually will be in. And that has always been my goal. That has always been my goal. So I think that more than anything else, it's very important that lawmakers across the country understand what the hopes and aspirations of the American people are. They want a system where everyone is in. And for those that have lost their jobs, take early retirements, they really should be able to buy in to Medicare. That would take care of a gap where people today are really left without anything. And that's very important. So it's early in this. You see where the speaker didn't take the bill up in the state legislature. But these are important movements because they keep pushing the edges of the envelope out. So I'm on a bill in Congress, Medicare for All, because I think it's important to just keep pushing.
Absolutely.
So we got a lot of questions
I know you did.
about voting and voting rights. And recently on KQED's forum, you said elections are the pillar of our democracy, and we believe thus as well with the League of Women Voters. We got questions around election machines, around Congress's role in protecting gerrymandering, voting rights. And the question is, what can we do to reinforce Congress's power to protect America's right to vote and ensure free, fair, and accessible elections in our country?
Well, I think number one, for our country, there was a case that was taken up by the Supreme Court, and they struck down a very important section of the Voting Rights Act. And the Congress has to take that back up again. That has always been bipartisan. I mean, it would pass with maybe one or two grumpy people that voted against it, either in the Senate or the House. It was always bipartisan until. So that, to me, is an essential, because that brings protections to states that need them, and where there has been a history of voter suppression, et cetera, et cetera. And I know we have a lot of questions, so I'm not going to delve into all of the get into the weeds on it. But that's number one. That's a must. I also think that we need to, secretaries of state across the country are always important. But right now, they are really in the driver's seat. Why? Because the president put together a commission on supposedly to protect the vote and whatever. But underneath it, he has put the vice president and, very importantly, the secretary of state from, I believe, Kansas, who has spent his entire adult life putting out and trafficking the following idea that we have overwhelming fraud in our election system in the country. We don't. Now, if there's one fraudulent vote cast, we're going to go after that. So I think this commission is a fraud in and of itself. So we have to rely on the public to rise up and not accept whatever they're going to put out, because the outcome, what they will recommend is more voter suppression. That's really what that is about, and that's what this chairman of the commission has always done. It's deeply disturbing. But we also have a huge challenge because we know definitively that the Russian government interfered in our election. The intelligence community, unanimous, all 17 agencies, that's such a rarity. I served on the House Intelligence Committee, it's usually consensus, but they said high confidence, that's very unusual. So what comes out of the special counsel's investigation is going to be instructive to the Congress about what we need to do. Because if we don't do anything, we know they're coming again. They will continue doing it. And just as technology has progressed and it has been a positive in many ways, it's still out there to be manipulated. So out of that, I think out of what former FBI Director Muller, and we all have enormous confidence in him, that will be instructive to the Congress as to what we need to do.
No, that's really important. In fact, we do have a question that was given to us, and I'll just sort of follow up with the investigation about the bipartisan senators who proposed the legislation to prevent the special counsel Mueller from being fired by the president without cause. Will the House be proposing similar legislation to ensure that this doesn't happen, that the investigation is completed?
Well, there are many issues attached to that. Obviously, the president is not pleased that there's a special counsel. And the special counsel now is investigating. When it was first appointed, it was about about what the Russians did and was there any collusion, any collusion. That investigation has spread now to 2 other areas. It's not only collusion, it is also obstruction of justice and essentially follow the money. So I believe that if the president were to attempt or actually fire the special counsel, that the Congress will just blow up on that.
Okay.
They will just blow up on that. And to date, the majority party has stuck with the president. They have grumbled quietly, but not publicly. But most importantly, as Abraham Lincoln said, public sentiment is everything. So it would be the American people that would rise up as well, because this is very, very serious.
Okay, well, let's go to some of those American people. We need to go to Q&A in the audience. So let's shift out to the audience and get our first question.
Thank you for being here, Congressman Eshoo.
Thank you.
You've spoken about some important issues, but there are all sorts of other equally distressing issues out there. North Korea, climate change, you name it. So my question to you today is, what is your heart most involved in with all of these issues to deal with?
Well, it's like drinking from a fire hose, because there are, with this new administration, you get to Friday and you try to recall what took place on Monday, and it seems like it was 5 years ago. There is so much. The Constitution. The Constitution is the soul of our nation. And that's what I take my oath to. The flag is the symbol of our nation, but the Constitution is the soul of our nation. So everything that I do has to meet what the Constitution calls for. And it's serious business. I'd like to see us make progress on health care because the American people are desperate for that. They're desperate for that. I want to see us work to protect the very good laws that are on the books but are being attacked in the executive branch, in the EPA. I don't know if you read Christine Todd Whitman's piece that she wrote this week. I think it was in the New York Times, and about science and scientists, and that's what guides us, and that's why we have the protections that the EPA then carries out. Clean air, clean water. These are public health issues. So the issues are enormous, and many of them are in the committee that I'm on. So whether it's foreign policy and what the president can and cannot do, and relative to military force, to health care, to all the environmental issues. I always used to think that once a law passed and was on the books, bravo, and move forward. Now we're in a place where the debate is coming back all over again, relitigating all of this. But make no mistake about it, there is enormous damage being inflicted in the executive branch. In the executive branch, because a secretary can do very good things, but they can also roll many good things away, and that's what's taking place. So,
Okay, let's take a second question.
Hello. The Trump administration has rescinded a rule requiring that the effects of climate change be considered before spending federal flood insurance monies. Do you think that Congress should make sure that real rebuilding efforts after the hurricanes should take the likelihood of future flooding into account before those funds are spent?
It's called mitigation. It's called mitigation and planning. If we just repeat the mistakes of the past, where, for example, homes, commercial buildings are built in the same place where they are subject to flood, et cetera, then there's an enormous price tag to it. This week we approved the first tranche of funding, over $8 billion for Harvey. We still have to contend with what's taking place with the alphabet of hurricanes. So Congress in the appropriation bill that we passed, I believe has mitigation in it. And future funding needs to include that as well. Because there's the immediate disaster relief, but then there's also what comes after that. And we learned many lessons from Katrina.
Okay, let's take one more question from the audience, and then we'll get back to Afghanistan.
Okay.
Thank you, Congresswoman. So we were talking about DACA, and we have all the sympathies for folks who are in that situation. But I'm here to kind of talk about a situation where 1.5 legal immigrants like me, engineers, doctors, scientists who have come to this country. And I'm actually, I came to the United States 10 years back for my graduate studies at Stanford. I got a full scholarship for that. But unfortunately, I am waiting almost 70 years. I'm looking at a 70-year wait, 70, for my green card, because I was born in India. We have an arbitrary, discriminatory 7% per country cap on employment-based green cards. We always believe employment should be based primarily on merit and skills. Shouldn't really matter whether I was born in India or Sri Lanka or any other country. But unfortunately we have this limit, and I can't easily switch jobs. I can't start my own business. My wife is on a dependent visa, and her studies are also dependent on it. And tomorrow, if I lose my job, I have to pack my bags and leave this country. And I don't even want to invest in a real estate
I know
here.
your case very well because we hear from scores of
Thank you.
constituents. So tell me your question.
Oh, so my question is, we have a bill right now which has 260 co-sponsors, and my question is whether can our caucus leadership take this up during their discussions with the speaker or the majority leader to be included in a CR or an omnibus or any other must-pass vehicle, or even the Immigration Dream Act or any other immigration bill that's being considered at this point.
Thank you for your question. It's a huge one. And what it points out, number one, is that our legal system, legal, is broken. And that's why comprehensive immigration reform is essential. It hasn't been addressed since 1987. That's a completely different America, 1987, even though it seems like yesterday to some of us. If we had a policy in place today, which is what I think we should do, and I have been on legislation for this, offered legislation on it, when someone comes to our country, receives their education, their higher education here, when they graduate, a green card should be stapled to their diploma, because we need the bright, educated people to stay here, not go someplace else and then compete against us. So it's a wrong-headed policy. I doubt that the question that you asked and the policy that you need, and I want you to have, I doubt that that will be attached to DACA. There has to be an agreement that the speaker allow the legislation to come to the floor. This is maddening to me, and it's not an excuse. That's how powerful the speaker is. So we have the legislation, and we have the majority that's required to pass the bill. Very few bills have 260 co-sponsors. The magic number is 218. That's the majority in the House. So I can't tell you if the majority is going to be in the mood to do this. I can't promise you that. What's very sad is that the Senate, in a previous Congress, passed a bipartisan, comprehensive legislation. They passed it. The Speaker refused to bring it up in the House, and we had the votes for it. So now, we don't have a president that seems to love immigrants the way I do, and everyone else here does, and understands what they do for we're a nation of immigrants. We're a nation of immigrants. So at some point, this will happen. I can't tell you when it's going to.
Thank you.
I wish I could.
We touched on topics that are important, like foreign policy, and I wanted to address that a little bit. The president laid out his vision for Afghanistan last month, and in your response to the president's remarks on Afghanistan, you stated, by failing to even mention the word Congress in his speech, the president believes he can move forward with a blank check for Afghanistan. Will Congress be asking the president to come before them for the approval of additional troops and a concrete plan?
Well, first of all, the president didn't come out with a vision. He just said he was going to add troops. And I've been to Afghanistan several times. Our troops are second to none. They sacrifice enormously there. I mean, there's so many of them in the middle of nowhere for months on end. They take your breath away when you meet them. You have such a sense of pride about them. And their families sacrifice a great deal. Now, we added, I think, 4,100 troops. The military have said, many have spoken out and said 4,100 is not going to change the dynamic in Afghanistan. I think the larger issue here, and this is the longest war we've ever been engaged in, the longest war. There are about 11,000 troops there, including the NATO troops. I think the larger issue is the whole issue of the authorization for military force. It's called AUMF. You have to keep in mind that the Constitution divides the war powers between Congress and the President. It's the President that asks the Congress for the okay. It's not Congress. It's not the other way around. It's a very important principle to remember, and it's based in our Constitution. Now, the AUMF that we're operating under today is the one that was authorized by the Congress when we were attacked on 9/11. And many of us have been pushing to have a new discussion, because I don't believe, and many members of Congress don't believe, including some Republicans, that the AUMF that we're operating under, it's just a ticket that the president has, and more than one president exercise. They don't want to come to the Congress. See, they just want to go and do what they wish to do. Now, the good news was that Congresswoman Lee from Oakland, she's been offering this every year at the Appropriations Committee. It passed. There was bipartisan votes for it. Well, I mean, we were all ecstatic. Before the defense bill came to the floor, in the dead of night, they yanked it out. They yanked it out. So this is a huge constitutional issue in my view. On the issue of Afghanistan, I haven't heard any new policy. And you have to remember why we went in. We went in to destroy essentially the rat's nest where Al-Qaeda had grown, and out of that, the attack on our country. But then we went sideways into Iraq, and we don't have enough time to discuss all of that here.
Should we continue with audience questions? A couple more audience questions.
Yeah, let's do. Is there another audience question? The mic's still around.
There she is.
Front row,
You would stand.
Marcia.
I'm concerned about public lands that are controlled by the federal government. It looks like there's moves to look for oil and gas in them and not protect them, make the national monuments smaller. I'd just like your opinion about what Congress can do about that.
Well, the Congress has, what's important to note is that previous Congresses have made, I think, enormous progress in protecting lands in our country. Federal lands are very important. They belong to the American people. Our national parks, lands that have been protected, made national monuments. In the last Congress, just before President Obama went out the door, he approved the national monument that I had legislation on. The new administration has a completely different view, that national lands, federal lands should be used for mining, for oil drilling, for these are sacred lands. These are sacred lands, and I think that we're called to be the stewards of these lands, to protect them. The Congress, the majority does not hold that view. There aren't enough, I should say, that hold that view. Now, they are going after national monuments. I wrote to the Secretary as soon as he was confirmed, and essentially saying, don't do this for the following reasons. You can distinguish yourself by announcing that you treasure our treasures. The national monument in our congressional district is right now not on the hit list. But they can do this. They have the power to do this. Unless Congress steps in and passes legislation to prevent it. But they can do this. The executive branch has the power to do it, which is chilling. There are some that want to sell off national parks.
Yep.
Imagine that.
Thank you for your contribution, service, and your dedication.
Thank you for yours.
I have a question about disability. Obviously, we need a lot of legislation. That's why it came about in the U.S. Quite a number of laws. I have a question. I just want to know what you suggest. What recourse does a citizen has when a superior court judge chose to discriminate a disabled woman? The woman has a verified disability, and the judge, through her ruling, decided that the woman should work.
Well, I'm not, it's hard for me to give you an answer because I think you have several questions. It seems like a specific case, and I don't know the case, but it seems to me if the individual doesn't agree with the decision, and I think they don't, that they have the right to appeal the case. Now, I don't know if the ADA figures into this case that you're referencing. If so, the lawyers should be examining that because that legislation, that law, is very broad and encompassing and has really changed the face of America relative to those that are disabled and the rights that they have and all the positive things that have come out of it. So I feel a bit hamstrung to give you a direct answer because I feel that I don't know all of the details. But certainly the individual has the right to appeal. And I would think that it seems to me, but I'm not positive because, again, I don't know the details of the case, that the ADA figures into this.
Okay, so we have just a few minutes left, so we're going to
Where does
move
time go?
more into what we call rapid fire.
Okay.
So let's get to some really Silicon Valley kinds of questions. Self-driving cars, cybersecurity. Why don't you tell us what's going on with those two issues with you?
Well,
Net
I
neutrality.
think, I think autonomous vehicles are 5 minutes away in terms of moving to scale. And I think it's very, very important because we know that as long as we have automobiles that emit any kind of pollution, that we're adding to the problems that we have to deal with.
What do you say to the folks that are worried about people losing their jobs? People
Well,
who are
I think
driving
that,
cars.
That'll affect them.
there are still people that have to build autonomous vehicles. There is, I think that every time we propose any of these things, that right next to it should be the pluses, so that that fear factor won't be there. We have changed from an agricultural society to the industrial age to, we just keep moving. We keep moving. And inequality in our national economy is certainly there, and we have to address that. But I think it would be very exciting. It is very exciting, and it's a new chapter, and I want America to be #1 in this. I don't want to cede our leadership to anyone else. So there are opportunities not only in terms of the manufacture of autonomous vehicles, there's an environmental plus to it. In terms of public transportation, imagine that we don't have to have these gigantic buses emitting, I don't know what they emit. This would be terrific for the disabled, for the elderly, that they can be picked up and dropped off where they want to be in a far more efficient manner. So I find it very exciting. We did a bill just this week, passed out of my committee, Energy and Commerce, and the Congress passed the bill. It's got to go over to the Senate. So, and our congressional district is the leader in this. So I'm excited about it. Net neutrality, some members call me the mother of net neutrality in the House, and I'm very proud of it. Someone asked me the other day, what is this net neutrality thing that you keep talking about? And I said, just think of it in the following way. Has anyone gotten on the plane, walked through first class, and then go to the back of the plane? That's what net neutrality is about. The large ISPs want to have their way. There's a lot of money at stake in this with the big guys. Make no mistake about it. And I don't think the internet would have ever become what it has become were it not open and accessible to everyone. And we want to keep it that way. So that's what net neutrality is about.
Okay.
And I will not stop fighting and rest until we win. We have courts that have agreed with us. So.
Great.
There was another question. I think it's an important question as it galvanized the country after Charlottesville. And this was a question from the audience that we received earlier. The Southern Poverty Law Center recently reported that a neo-Nazi group, the Daily Stormer, has a presence in Mountain View. What is the appropriate response to this news? How should we balance condemnation of this group with respect for free speech? And how do you think we in the audience should respond versus the local police and elected officials, including yourself?
Well, first of all, I think that we all need to pull back and understand our history. History is human. There's always been dark undersides in our country. It didn't just start now. It's always been there. What is so shocking today, to me, is that we have a president that seems to embrace it. So it's up to people, community by community, to number one, appreciate what we have in the Constitution, because the Constitution guides us. We have rights, and people that belong to these organizations, as much as I oppose them, they have rights too.
So when do we draw the line?
Where do we draw the line? Around what is not legal. Because we're a nation of laws. We're a nation of laws. And I think that whenever there are, and I've done this in my life, and I'm sure there's a record in the federal government. I've always wanted to find out what's in my record. I mean, I have gone out and protested peacefully. That is very important for people to do. It isn't always everyone's cup of tea, but I think peaceful protestation is very important to send a signal not only to these organizations, we're here, this is what we believe in, and we will always stand.
And fortunately,
with that.
we've been seeing a lot of that. People coming out, Boston, everywhere, every state after Charlottesville. It was just
Well, that's why I say my hope is alive, because people are doing this. The American people, they know the difference between right and wrong, and bad things, and hateful things, and racist comments, and neo-Nazi, and KKK, and all of that. And I would think that most people would be very surprised or shocked to hear this, what you just described. I'm not. I'm not. Because again, this is the dark underside of the country, and it's always been there. And but I do think that our local police departments, people in the community, all have their role to play. All have their role to play, and we have a constitutional right to protest. And where I draw the line is, so to speak, and I'm going to sound like my mother, is two wrongs don't make a right. You see? And so the peaceful protest that is highly affirmative about what we believe in and what our country is about and the best of us, that needs to be expressed by people. That's the most eloquent statement in our society when we stand there and say that. Yeah.
So some of the places where that's being said is in our press. And I talked at the beginning about our politics being a spectator sport. But we are also seeing, and a question came to us about the weakening and dismissal of the press. Is there a way to strengthen the press's First Amendment rights?
Well, let me put it this way. I think that the press, has a place in the Constitution, number one. And it's essential. You look around the world and you look at dictatorships, you don't find any free press. I mean, it's a first sign that there's something very bad going on. So we may not like how someone reports. Politicians don't ever think that they're being treated fairly in the press. That's a good push and pull. That's very healthy. But I think during the presidential election that they fell down on their job because they did not vet the way they're supposed to. It was more a form of entertainment. I don't know what it was. And now we're all having to deal with it. And it's deeply disturbing to have the President of the United States constantly attacking the press. I do think they're doing their job now. The investigative reporting that's being done is it's very deep, it's very broad, it's very thoughtful, and it should be. It should be. We all benefit from that. I always know that I always say this, I brag about all of you. I say to my colleagues, my constituents read, therefore they think, therefore they analyze, therefore they will never be politically manipulated. You see? And so that's the press is essential in that. The press is essential.
Okay, let's go to the audience for a question.
Thank you, Congresswoman Eshoo, for being here. I'm a
Wonderful to
great
see you.
advocate for early childhood education, like many of the members of the league. And it seems most of our problems are because we're not looking at the future for our children and families. And it's the greatest way we had early childhood education for all that is universal, high quality, and affordable would be the greatest way to abolish the massive growing inequality between people in this country. What can we do to push it ahead? What can Congress do to light the fire for our children and their future and their brain development?
We're
Thank
almost
you.
at closing, so.
I support it. Barbara Boxer and I, she's not even in the Senate anymore, in the Congress, did a bill many, many years ago that has been introduced and reintroduced. But there's something here that I think is very important, and that is that if there are many wonderful models that spring up in different parts of the country, that the federal government would be attracted to that and say, it's working here, it's working there, and then have a national umbrella. Because we know from all the studies of the child's brain, what they learn in their first 3-4 years of life sets the pattern. And so we're not honoring that. We're not honoring that. And to optimize the gift that they represent is very important for our country. It's very important for our country. I think because of all the attacks on public education, we're paying a real price for it. A real price for it because we don't have independent thinking in the country. And then there's political manipulation. They're easier to manipulate. So absolutely. Healthcare should be universal as well as education.
So we are nearing the end of our time, but I thought we'd end with where we started, which is strengthening our democracy. We got one question from the audience about the Problem Solvers Caucus, which you may want to comment on. But also, just in closing, how can we all be problem solvers? Whether that's coming up with bipartisan support, educating our citizens, getting people to vote. But what are your thoughts on both that caucus and how we can move forward as problem solvers? What gives you hope?
Well, before there's problem solving, we have to have people in the system that are problem solvers, that want to go into government because they respect it, and they also understand that it's an instrument for good. It reflects the population. It's about all of us. And so I think that there has to be more involvement in elections. We just have to. We change things through elections. And if there's anyone that's listening in or seated here today thinking, well, she's talking about the Democrats, I'm talking about everyone. I think that it would be a sea change if all states did redistricting the way California does, because the gerrymandering produces the opportunity for people to go to Congress or to a state legislature that have no intention of making government better and being a problem solver. You have to develop consensus. You have to understand that consensus means we both come to the table with good ideas. Hopefully they're good ideas, but you have to give. There's give and take in that. You saw this week with what the Democratic leadership did. I mean, it was like this beautiful thing that just fell out of heaven, and thank God. But they said, we believe this is the best way to go forward. We can get this done, hurricane funding. We don't have to shut down the government. We can get these things done. And the president said, okay.
All right.
So-
I think that's a
hope. I
great,
think
I
that
think
gives
that's
us
a
a lot
great
of
way to
hope, yeah.
close. We're going to wrap, and we just want to thank everyone, and thank you for getting
Thank you.
things done.
Thank you to the league.
Thank
You're
you.
the best. Thank you. Thank you.
And thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
We
We
survived.
have some announcements for some upcoming events.
Yeah, do you want to do that? Why don't you do it? I think we're done.
Okay.